Welcome to Between the Rows, where you get to hear the stories behind the stories in Canada's leading farm publications.
Hi, and welcome to Between the Rows. I'm your host this week, Laura Rance. COVID-19 continues to be an overriding influence on just about everything we do, and this week's guests reflect that reality. But as our first item illustrates, some things haven't changed. One of those is the need for good agronomy to support decision-making on the farm. Marissa Bourgault is the first Western Grains Research Foundation Integrated Agronomy Chair at the University of Saskatchewan. The farmer-funded foundation is investing $2 million over the next 7 years to support this program. I reached Marissa in her home office this week to talk about how farmers and researchers can work together to improve the science of agronomy in Western Canada. Here's our conversation. Hi, Marissa. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me.
So, first of all, just tell me a little bit about your background and how you came to be at the University of Saskatchewan.
Previous to this job, I was actually an assistant professor at the Montana State University Research Center in Havre. So that's about 45 minutes away from the Canadian border. So I was working on cropping systems and agronomy there. And I did that for about 3 years. Previous to that, I was a postdoc and an extension agronomist in Australia. I originally got to Australia to finish my PhD. So I was supposed to be there for 7 months, but met people, got jobs, and the 7 months turned into 9 years.
Wow.
But originally I'm from the French part of Canada, so I'm from Quebec, and I got my PhD, my bachelor and my PhD actually from McGill University, and I did some work through in my graduate studies in Uzbekistan as well, where I worked at with irrigation management in bean crops. And Uzbekistan is the large irrigation scheme in Uzbekistan is responsible for the drying of the Aral Sea. So I became quite concerned about the environmental costs of large scale irrigation schemes, and that's really at the beginning of when I started to be more interested in figuring out how to grow crops, with the rain that we got, and how to make the most out of the rainfall that we get.
So what is the mandate of this new research chair? And the second part of that question is, how does that international experience position you for fulfilling that mandate?
So our mandate is to establish a research program that is both multidisciplinary and obviously collaborative, because we want to explore questions that go beyond single disciplines and beyond single crops, and look at the system as a whole rather than individual questions. So in many ways, we're looking at a research program that's medium to long term. So questions that might not be resolved right away, but that might have an impact over time. And your second part of the question was about the international. I've had experience. Most of my experience has always been into semi-arid environments. So we've, different climates. Obviously, Australia, Canada are very different. But what all of these environments have in common is that our agriculture is very limited by the amount of rainfall that we get, or the amount of water that the crop actually has. So that's always been an interest of mine, and there's many ways that we can improve how much or how efficient we are at capturing and using that rainfall. And some of it is genetic, but a lot of it is agronomic as well, and it's how we deal with the system.
So this program will involve multi-disciplines within the research community, but it's also going to, as I understand it, involve farmer collaborators. Why is farmer participation in this kind of research important?
Yes. So before I get into that, I want to say that I'm very fortunate at the University of Saskatchewan to have such expertise in various disciplines. So I think we're going to be great there in having farmers collaborate with a number of experts as well. I think is going to be great. As a scientist, with Montana State University being a land-grant university, we had an advisory board that was meeting twice a year, and that advisory board was mostly farmers, but also a few industry representatives. And as a scientist, I found it very helpful to be able to discuss ideas with farmers and industry before you start doing the work or before you start asking for money or asking for grants. And so having that feedback is extremely helpful. And so that's before we start doing the research, but having on-farm experimentation is also quite useful. I had one farmer that said, well, people keep telling me to do like 2 or 3 acres and test it out, and I don't want to do that because if it's not 100 acres, it's not worth my time. And I as a scientist, I understand that, but then at the same time, I know how much money is involved in 100 acres, and I don't want people to go and invest that much into an idea that hasn't been proven, even if it's my idea. so having that, 2-3 acres where we manage it in collaboration with the farmers is actually really helpful, because if there is problems, with machinery that doesn't quite work out, or things that we haven't seen as scientists working in small plots, we can troubleshoot that there at the 2 acres rather than 100 acres. So in some ways, we love our farmers collaborators as well, because if it works, they're great advocates for the new practice, because right. I can say all sorts of things, but farmers have a very different perspective on this. And sometimes they see things in the data that we haven't looked at, because we tend to be focused on the questions that we ask for. And so sometimes having farmers there to look at it and say, well, actually, that two contrasts between the two treatments that we weren't looking at. I had one once that made an economic analysis and said, well, that's a 4-time return on investment, just having more seeds in the ground. And I had never thought about that, but because that wasn't the question we were looking at, but it's really interesting to have that feedback.
I guess too, it's, the science that I grew up with, you ask one question or have one hypothesis, and you try to eliminate all of the variables and try to answer that question. Whereas in farming, it can't be that linear a process. It has to be multidimensional. But that must complicate the research process incredibly when you're asking questions that you may have to come at those questions from a multidimensional perspective.
Yeah, it does. And I think it's why it's important to have, someone dedicated to making sure that we've got enough people, enough expertise to look at the different perspectives there. Because, breeders are busy, pathologists are busy as well, and they have one perspective, and they've been doing quite a bit of agronomic research, because we've sort of lost some of that expertise, because I think the genomics and genetics and all of that became popular, and then basic agronomy research in the last 20 years kind of fell out of fashion. Like, it wasn't as sexy as other disciplines, or at least it was that way when I was going through undergrads and graduate school. So I think we need to build this back in having as I said, having enough people, enough expertise, and someone making sure that happens, and that happens well at all levels, I think is it's going to be fun.
So how has the COVID-19 crisis or the pandemic affected your program plans?
Yeah, these are interesting times. I started March 1st, and so 2 weeks. It took 2 weeks before Saskatchewan went into emergency. What's the
lockdown?
Lockdown, yes. So I really didn't have time to really settle in my office, honestly, before I had to start working from home. So it's been a bit more difficult to have, discussions, because it's not the same having a discussion over email about research ideas than it would be over coffee, and then there was a lot of uncertainty about what we would be able to do, both at the university, in the labs, and in the field. So it's been a slow start because of that, and it's been a bit more difficult to talk to people and set up collaborations. This said, I am at home. Part of my job is to write grants, finish papers from previous jobs. So that's definitely still happening. And in some ways, having the flexibility of doing what I want when I want, it's something that we don't usually have, with the field season. So,
have you thought at all about how this is going to change things over the longer term? I mean, we keep talking about when things get back to normal, and I'm asking this question of just about everybody I talk to these days. But we are going to be looking at a new normal. But are there opportunities here, do you think, for agriculture and for cropping systems to come out of this with some learnings that really position the industry for the future, a more sustainable future?
That's a hard question. I'm not completely sure, but I think as teachers, we're getting a lot more familiar with remote technologies. So video, but making videos as informational tools for our students, as well as connecting with people that are further out. And so I think we're getting communication skills that we might not have had previously, in trying to get the same or something similar to a coffee date, but having that remotely. So I think that's one thing. Also, I think for outreach, we might be in a better position to actually make information more available and maybe more interesting if we're able to have videos all of a sudden, and podcasts, and technology that we might not have used because we're used to teaching in classroom or workshop in person.
Do you think it's going to have an impact on the kinds of research questions you ask in agronomy?
Well, I hope not, because I hope not. I hope we'll be able to teach students to do things without, being close by, potentially using technology. But I think, the problems in agriculture are similar to what they were, and at least, if we're looking at the physical system. I mean, weed resistance is not going away with COVID-19.
That hasn't been changed. Yeah.
No, it hasn't. so in that sense, we still have similar problems that what we had before. There might be things at some point, in the supply chain that might be that might change. And that I'm not sure that at the integrated agronomy will touch that a lot.
Like, we still need to have good agronomy. I mean, those basic fundamental issues underlying both the success and the failures that we have in agriculture haven't really been changed by this.
No, it hasn't. But yeah, and to go back to your question, it might be at some point that the practices that we propose, the logistics of putting them in place for farmers might actually be a little bit different, and that's might be where we're going to have to look at the new normal and how that's going to work.
Well, thank you very much for joining me today.
Yeah, my pleasure.
We'll check back with you when you can finally get some programs into the field.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks again, Marissa.
Bye-bye.
That was Marissa Bugot, who is the first Western Grains Research Foundation Integrated Agronomy Chair. She's based at the University of Saskatchewan. This is Between the Rows. I'm Laura Rance. We're starting to talk a lot about the new normal in agriculture these days, because it's becoming apparent that some of the operational changes implemented during the COVID-19 pandemic will be sticking around long after this crisis is over. And that will be because they make things better. John Gregg, editor of Farmtario, has been writing about how paper transactions for common business dealings on the farm could be a thing of the past. Here's our conversation about his story. Hi, John.
Hi, Laura.
How has the pandemic changed how companies deal with farmers?
Well, I think there's a couple of things that the pandemic has forced into that relationship, and the first is economic, and the second is to keep people safe. And a lot of that comes down to how do you decrease the interaction that's been so critical in farming, the face-to-face interaction. And a lot of that face-to-face interaction has maintained some practices like moving paper and handing people invoices and shipping, receiving documents and those sorts of things. And those are now being driven out of the system a bit. And some people say for the better.
So what kinds of transactions are being affected?
So there really are two things. There's transactions that come by mail or in the office, and that's accounts receivable and payable. And in my discussions with some companies, they've been able to get most of their employees out of their offices and working from home. And the exception for some of them is their accounts receivable and payables staff. So those people still have to come into the office to physically open checks and then physically use their systems to then resend out checks. So but if those people are electronic payments or sending out electronic payments, they could do that remotely. So it's kind of that's one of their biggest risk factors for agriculture companies. So that's why they're really pushing, in some cases, in giving farmers incentives to move to electronic invoicing and payment. And then the second is when a delivery is made, in many, whether it's a feed delivery or a seed delivery or fertilizer delivery, they are finding new ways of, when you receive something, there has to be a signature or a receipt, a way to say that, yes, I've received those goods. And so there are electronic ways. There's something called DocuSign that some companies are using that just allows you to sign your signature on your phone. There are ways of receiving a text message that has a code in it, and you just send back the code, which is your confirmation of receipt. And that just allows you not to exchange any sort of document that could be a risk, or having to get close to somebody, which is also a risk.
When you're used to doing business and there's a paper trail, as they call it, and often people tend to rely on the so-called paper trail. How are farmers reacting to this change in how this kind of business is conducted?
I think from what I hear, generally well. Farmers are now very comfortable with their phones, with email, with text messages. And this is really just a step beyond in using those tools, kind of a single step beyond really in using those tools. So I think that it has actually gone better than some people expected, some agricultural suppliers expected. But although they certainly are quick to say, there are some who still do like their paper bills and their paper receipts, and they find ways of doing that. You can leave a receipt in a mailbox, after a delivery, that sort of thing. Or you can, some companies say that some farmers are a bit disgruntled in that they now are saying, well, you send me the receipt by email, but then I have to print it out at home, and it's costing me printer paper and printer ink and time to do that. But I think they're missing the point.
It didn't cost any paper and ink to do that before. It just that now it's coming out of the farmer's ink and paper.
Yes, and then the further point is maybe it's time not to print everything out. That those documents can be kept on a computer and digital system. A lot of the latest iterations of farm accounting programs have very nice and easy options for managing invoices electronically, which are actually quite slick and actually save you time, because they'll actually input the data for you once you get onto it. So that's where they're really being pushed in that direction. Some just because it's kind of what we have to do. Others happily, and others maybe not quite so well.
So we talk about things getting back to normal, but is this one of the new normals that we've been talking about? It doesn't sound likely that we'll go back to what they did before.
Yeah, I think so. And I think part of it is that once you learn to do something that is quicker and more efficient, you actually go, oh, I probably should have been doing that already, right? And there's just a lot of us are resistant to those sorts of things until we're forced into them. And certainly I think there's even things like the way that deliveries are being made as far as packaging deliveries and timing deliveries that are people in the ag supply business are telling me are just making things a little quicker, a little better for the way that they can deliver service. And some of that, the backbone of that is having kind of digital information versus the paper trail.
So how do digital transactions factor into some of the other trends that we see in agriculture these days? I'm thinking in terms of traceability and blockchain.
Yeah, the base of, so people, when I talk to people often in the technology sector outside of agriculture, I always push very hard back when they tell me, well, farming's one of the last basic areas of the economy that has not been influenced by technology, and I list off the many areas where agriculture is actually a significant leader in technology. But where they're right and where they can catch me is that we've not digitized the information. So we haven't put that information into a digital form. And most of us have the tools in our hands and on our farms to do that. There just hasn't been something that's really driven it. And people thought it would be traceability, in potential liability, and blockchain that would drive those sorts of things. But it turns out it's need to be something that was even a little more, a little more immediate, I guess, a little more, something that forces us in the day to day. Now, I'm not sure we're going to get to all those things immediately, whether it's the traceability or blockchain. There's certainly issues with all those things, but certainly the more we have data and information digitized, the more that we can do with it. There's been a lot of concerns with farmers about the who owns the data, all that, who has hands on my data. But I think some of those answers are just being driven, and the hard answers are being found just because of because they have to be in the current state we're in.
It's really quite striking to me that this is probably a very good example of how this crisis is driving innovation. I mean, it's driving innovation at a pace that we couldn't have anticipated, just as it's changing a lot of other things that we're doing in ways that we couldn't have anticipated. But in this case, it could actually be a fundamental change in the infrastructure that farmers use to conduct business.
Mm-hmm. I think so. The farm suppliers say they're all eager to get back to the face-to-face, which is, that's how farmers and people in ag supply, how we exchange information and business intelligence. But I think the underlying change in the way that some of the data and the information has moved, I don't think that's going to change. And I think it's an innovation that's probably going to be good for the sector.
Thanks very much for joining me today, John.
No problem. Thanks, Laura.
That was John Gregg, editor of Farmtario. Our next item takes us to Alberta, where workers in management in Canada's 2 largest beef processing plants have been trying to gain the upper hand in their fight against the virus. Lisa Gunther, editor of Canadian Cattleman magazine, recently wrote a 3-part series that digs a little deeper into the impact that COVID-19 has had on meat plant workers and why they are so vulnerable. We talked about how the project has changed her perspective on this critical link in our food supply. Hi, Lisa.
Hi, Laura. How are you?
I'm good. And you?
Good.
So just fill us in a little bit on the background to this 3-part series.
Well, I started this when things really started to heat up, I guess, at the meat plants in Brooks and Cargill. As I'm sure our listeners know, those 2 plants account for the vast majority of the cattle slaughter in Canada. So they're really important to our beef supply chain.
About 70%, correct?
Yeah, around there, yeah. So, yeah, I just wanted to know more about what was going on within those communities around the plants.
And what prompted you to start digging a little deeper into this?
It was partly actually conversations I had with people who aren't in agriculture, and I just realized I couldn't answer some of their questions. So, yeah, and I just wondered how it was that this disease was spreading so quickly among that workforce.
And so what did you learn in the research that you did?
So this series really, I should preface and say this series really didn't focus on what was happening in the plant again, but just within the communities. And so I learned a lot, or I learned a fair bit about how those employees live and just kind of their daily lives and the challenges they face. For example, the housing, there's no one typical housing situation for these employees. It could be single people sharing an apartment with roommates, or extended families, or a couple of families sharing a house. So there was quite a range, and that just all made it really challenging for people to self-isolate if they did become infected with COVID.
And so people, is it because of the availability of housing, or is it because of the backgrounds of where they came, like the places that they've come from, or what was behind some of these perhaps different living arrangements than what we're accustomed to here in Canada?
So yeah, these, it's not so much availability from what I learned, but these employees are immigrants. Quite a bit of Cargill's employees are from the Philippines, for example. There are also workers from Vietnam. And a lot of it is, for example, wanting to send money to family back home. So they're trying to save money in Canada, and housing is a big chunk of all of our living expenses in Canada. So that's one way to save that money.
So what surprised you the most about these stories?
Actually, what I found the most surprising was just how quickly the case numbers escalated, especially in High River. I was just shocked by how quickly those numbers climbed. Yeah. Because we know those plants deal with measures to prevent food safety issues. So I guess I expected that they would have a better handle on controlling COVID, but in retrospect, that was actually a really naive assumption, because it's not the same as a foodborne pathogen at all. So.
And as you pointed out in these stories, it wasn't just the conditions in the plant that factored into this. It was the transportation, it was housing conditions, it was really a more of a community problem in the sense that these populations of workers had no ability to self-isolate once they left the plant even.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it is, and High River is very close to Calgary, which has had higher case numbers from the start of this pandemic. So that's another thing to keep in mind. But yeah, I mean, even just carpooling to work, they were told not to carpool. Well, how do you suddenly make other arrangements when you maybe don't have a vehicle or whatever? Like, and same with the housing situation. If you're in a house with an extended family, how do you suddenly manage to self-isolate without support? So I think those were factors in how this spread.
Has there been an element of blaming the victim surface in all this?
Yeah, that was one thing that the people I talked to were concerned about when I first started working on this story. And by the time it was published, that was already happening, both online and even in communities. Others have reported that people who look like they're from the Philippines are being turned away at grocery stores, for example, whether or not they actually work at Cargill. And I mean, not every Cargill worker was infected, and some of them, actually the vast majority, are now recovered from COVID that were infected. So
when I read through these stories, I just thought, these are it's the kind of story that kind of sticks with you, and I just wondered if that's how you feel about it and why.
It really is one I think that will stick with me, partly from my own sense of guilt for honestly not thinking about these workers as much as I should have perhaps before this, especially because they're such a crucial part of our industry and our society. They're doing jobs that others in Canada don't want to do. And so for them to then be afraid of becoming sick or becoming sick themselves and being afraid perhaps of infecting other people. And then, not only that, but then to get scapegoated by some people at the end of it. I just thought that was really unfair. So my heart really goes out to them.
It's a group of or a very critical part of the sector that probably a lot of us don't really think about, even though we're tied quite closely to agriculture. We don't think about the people that run the processing parts of that food chain very, very much at all, if we do at all.
Yeah, no, and I think that's maybe something I've learned about my own blind spot, I guess, in this is, and it's something that this pandemic has really revealed, not just about workers in meat plants, but the folks working in continuing care homes and even, people cleaning and doing janitorial services or working in grocery stores. These are all people that have been deemed essential. And in some cases, they're putting themselves at higher risk. And they're not positions that we've necessarily given a lot of thought to, I guess, in society. So.
Right. So what happens next in the meat sector? We know from the news reports this week that clearly COVID-19 hasn't abandoned the meat industry. We've got another plant temporarily closed in Canada. But what do you think are the next steps for the sector in trying to address this?
Well, in the Cargill or in the High River and Brooks and Calgary areas, Alberta Health Services really ramped up their testing. In fact, yesterday, or I should say Monday, Dr. Dina Hinshaw, Alberta's Chief Medical Officer, said that people in the Calgary zone who are asymptomatic now can go in for COVID tests too. Anyone that works at the Cargill or JDS plants can also go in for testing, and I'm sure has been. I guess one spot of good news is I was looking at the active case numbers as of Monday, and the vast majority of workers who were infected at Cargill, JDS, as well as Harmony, have recovered. Harmony's down to 16 active cases and 22 recovered, so over half recovered. And JBS and Brooks, it's the vast majority. They're both double digit, and the vast majority have recovered. So perhaps these measures are starting to work, we hope. They're also taking more precautions within the plants. Cargill checks temperatures twice a day or twice per shift among their workers. They put up all kinds of plexiglass guards. So I think they're learning within the plant, and I think there's more community support. So I'm cautiously optimistic, I guess.
Well, thank you very much for joining us today, Lisa.
Thank you.
That was Lisa Gunther, editor of Canadian Cattleman. This is Between the Rows. I'm your host this week, Laura Rance. Our last item today is our weekly look at the markets and weather. When I reached out to Bruce Burnett, Glacier FarmMedia's Director of Weather and Markets Information, for an update, I found him in the field. Hi, Bruce.
Hi.
So, Bruce, I think most of us are working at home, but you're not even working at home right now. Where are you today?
Well, I'm at my brother's farm, and we're continuing with the Harvest 19, sort of a little bit of a parallel to COVID-19, I guess. It's stretched over the year and is now 2020.
And so I guess there's a lot of farmers in the same position. You're having to finish up from last year before we get started on this year. How is that going? Is there anything out there to harvest, let alone a salvage operation?
Well, I think for the most part, a lot of the crop is sort of just salvage in terms of grain quality. It's taken a beating over the winter, whether it's canola or wheat or any other cereal. In fact, just sort of locally, I can see a few stubble fires burning where instead of combining, I think some guys have decided that burning the crop's probably a little bit more positive in terms of extending energy and time. So it's a difficult situation. We do have not only the harvest operations, but also to get the sort of what traditionally is fall field work and again planting underway. But farmers are moving along. Again, I would say the biggest operations that I observed driving out to the farm is mostly on the fertilizer application side of things. Although there's a lot of seeders now starting to get into the fields here as the temperatures warm up.
It's taken a while for spring to actually feel like spring. I mean, are we through this kind of cold weather pattern that we've been having?
Well, again, it's the Canadian prairie, so you never say never. But it looks as if this cold air mass that's coming down from Siberia, northern Canada, or whatever you want to call it, is going to recede a little bit here and move away. And we're going to get back into more typical temperatures and a little bit above normal, especially out in the western areas of the prairie. So that's good news. We're going to then see better temperatures here, and of course the soils will dry up a bit, and we'll get a chance to get the crop planted here, I think.
So we are starting to see some cedars move in some parts of the prairies. Has it become widespread yet?
Well, certainly I'd say on the southern prairie, south of number 1 highway, it's widespread, and there's a lot of farmers there that are, getting close to half done in some regions even. So you're seeing, especially the early crops to go in, some of the cereal crops like durum, some of the pea crops getting planted here. In the central and northern areas, it's a little bit slower, and I'd say especially up in the northern areas, because that's where more of this harvest is left to complete as well. So it's a mixed bag here. I would say that we're not going to see widespread operations in the northern growing areas for at least another week, I would say, at least anyway right now. But it depends a lot from location to location.
So we're still, we're still on track for, a reasonable seeding window, though, in most parts of the prairies?
Yes, there's a good chance we're going to get the crop planted, maybe not normal in terms of planting, but certainly just a little bit later than normal. But as I said, it depends. In some of the southern areas, it looks like those farmers are going to get completed on time, as long as we don't get any adverse weather here in the second half of May. I think really things are looking pretty good now on that front. The forecast is looking fairly positive in terms of keeping those really heavy rains away from the prairies.
Now, just switching gears here, normally you would start to see this, or we would see this period of time in the shipping season as being kind of a slower period of activity, but the railways have been hitting record targets. What's behind that?
Well, I think a lot of it is likely due to the COVID situation. And what has happened is that the demand for other commodities that the railways haul, let's call it intermodal or cars, and even some of the iron ore and those types of things are settling back. And so the one crop that is, or the one sector that is moving is the grain sector. So we're seeing very, very good grain movement. They have lots of capacity in terms of their trains to hook up to grain cars. So we're seeing that in terms of the numbers, both on the export side as well as the rail car loadings.
So, Bruce, are the markets holding their own in the major commodities for farmers here?
Yeah, certainly we're seeing some bump up in prices, especially for some certain commodities. We're seeing specials in canola and even wheat, so the basis levels are improving considerably for those crops. Again, it depends a bit on the region and the quality, but certainly those are the two crops that are moving very strongly. As well, we're seeing very strong prices for special crops. Again, part of the COVID demand seems to be for things like lentils and peas and those types of commodities. So we're seeing some very strong demand there and prices increase. So we're seeing the prices solidify. Whether or not we can get too much of a rally out of this is yet to be seen, but certainly this is a good sign as we get into planting this year's crop.
I guess with some countries and some of Canada's export competitors actually freezing some of their exports in order to maintain domestic supplies, that really positions Canada well to maybe be a supplier to some of the export markets that maybe are undersupplied at this point in time.
Yeah, I think we're certainly seeing some pickup in demand there from areas, even countries that are just, I would, for lack of a better word, stockpiling a little bit extra in order to make sure they have enough supplies around. Again, we're seeing a fairly strong demand profile here. Of course, the problem is that we still, at least on a global basis, have some fairly adequate supplies here. So that's going to keep prices from really moving strongly higher for commodities. But things like durum, we're seeing some drought conditions in North Africa. That's boosted durum demand, and we were certainly shipping a lot of durum this year relative to last year. So again, we're seeing certain commodities having some very strong premiums in the market right now.
Well, thanks, Bruce, for taking some time off the combine this afternoon to fill us in.
Thanks a lot.
We'll talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.
That was Bruce Burnett, Director of Weather and Markets Information for Glacier FarmMedia. That's all we have for you on this week's Between the Rows, but we'll be back again next week with more stories from the Canadian Farm Beat. We hope you'll join us then. I'm Laura Rance.
Between the Rows is a production of Glacier FarmMedia, Canada's leading farm publisher. We'd love to hear what you think of the show and invite you to send your comments to btr@farmmedia.com or visit us at membersgetmore.ca and sign up today